If your dog is in pain right now, would you even know before it's too late? The vet didn't raise her voice, didn't rush, didn't panic, but the way she looked at Ethan made his chest tighten in a way he couldn't explain, like something had already gone wrong long before this moment, and he was just now catching up to it. Shadow lay quietly on the exam table, still, alert, eyes following Ethan like always, the same loyal gaze he'd seen 1,000 times before, and yet something about it felt different now, not weaker. Not louder, just harder to read, like there was a layer between them that hadn't been there before. Ethan reached out, instinctively, gently brushing his hand along Shadow's side the way he always did, expecting that familiar lean, that subtle shift closer, that silent confirmation of trust, but instead Shadow held still, not pulling away, not reacting at all, just existing in place, and somehow that nothing felt heavier than any obvious reaction ever could. "He's been like this for a while?" the vet asked, and Ethan nodded quickly, almost defensively, because in his mind nothing had really changed, not in any way that felt serious, just small things, things that didn't seem worth worrying about, things like sleeping a little farther away, taking a little longer to get up, licking the same spot over and over again like it was just a habit, just a quirk, just one of those things dogs do. "I thought he was just getting older," Ethan said, the words sounding thinner out loud than they did in his head, like they couldn't quite hold the weight he wanted them to carry. The vet didn't respond right away, she just glanced back at Shadow, then at Ethan again, and that pause stretched long enough to make everything feel louder, the hum of the lights, the faint ticking of a clock somewhere in the room, the quiet rhythm of Shadow's breathing. "Dogs don't show pain the way you think," she finally said, calm but firm, and something about that sentence landed deeper than Ethan expected, because it didn't feel like new information. It felt like something he should have already known. He looked back at Shadow, really looked this time, replaying the past few weeks. In fragments, moments he'd brushed off without a second thought, and for the first time those moments didn't feel random anymore, they felt connected, like pieces of something he had missed while it was happening right in front of him. And suddenly the scariest thought wasn't that Shadow might be in pain now, it was that he had been trying to say it all along, quietly, consistently, in ways Ethan had seen but never understood. 3 weeks earlier, nothing about Shadow felt urgent, nothing felt like a problem that needed fixing, and that was exactly why Ethan did not see it. Mornings looked the same as they always had, sunlight slipping through the kitchen window, the soft sound of a coffee machine running, and Shadow lying nearby, quiet but present, watching him with that same steady attention that had always made Ethan feel like he was never alone. And if there was a difference, it was subtle enough to disappear into routine, like the way Shadow no longer rushed to the door when Ethan grabbed his keys, or how he took a few extra seconds to stand up, shifting his weight in a way that seemed almost thoughtful, almost deliberate, not weak, not injured, just slower. And Ethan told himself that was normal, that dogs age, that energy changes, that not everything needs a deeper meaning. On walks, Shadow still followed, still stayed close. But the distance between them stretched just a little more than it used to, a few extra feet, a few extra pauses where Shadow would stop and lower his head slightly, focusing on something Ethan could not see, and Ethan would tug gently on the leash, smiling to himself, thinking his dog was just being stubborn or distracted, never considering that hesitation might be something else entirely. At home, Shadow began spending more time lying on the hardwood floor instead of the couch, choosing cooler, harder surfaces, and when Ethan noticed, he joked about it out loud, calling Shadow dramatic, assuming it was just a preference, just one of those random habits dogs develop, not a signal, not a message, just behavior without meaning. Even the small details blended into the background, like the way Shadow licked the same spot on his leg over and over again during quiet evenings, or how he shifted away slightly when Ethan reached down to pet him unexpectedly, not pulling away sharply, not showing any clear sign of discomfort, just a subtle adjustment, a quiet repositioning that was easy to miss if you were not looking for it. And Ethan was not looking for it, because in his mind, nothing was wrong, nothing had changed in any serious way. And the absence of something obvious made everything feel safe, made it easy to believe that what he was seeing was just personality, just mood, just time passing. But the truth was unfolding in those small moments, not loudly, not dramatically, but consistently, each behavior carrying a weight Ethan could not yet recognize, each quiet shift adding up to something real, something important, something Shadow had been trying to communicate without a single sound. And the most dangerous part was not that the signs were invisible, it was that they were visible enough to be seen, but not understood. By the end of that first week, the small changes had settled into a pattern, but to Ethan it still felt like nothing more than coincidence layered on routine, the kind of subtle shift that happens without meaning anything at all, and that belief made everything easier to ignore. Shadow continued licking the same spot on his front leg, not constantly, not obsessively, just enough to become familiar. Like background noise you stop hearing after a while, and every time Ethan noticed, he would glance down, pause for a second, then move on, telling himself it was probably dry skin or a minor irritation, something that would pass on its own without needing attention. What Ethan did not see was how consistent it was, how it always returned to the same place, how it happened more often during quiet moments when Shadow was not distracted, as if his body was trying to draw attention to something deeper without making a sound. At the same time, something else was shifting, something even harder to catch, because it was not about what Shadow did, it was about what he stopped doing, the eye contact that used to come naturally, the way Shadow would look up at Ethan and hold that gaze for just a second longer than necessary. A silent connection that had always been there began to fade, replaced by brief glances that ended quickly, like Shadow was choosing distance without fully breaking the bond. Ethan noticed it once or twice, a fleeting thought passing through his mind that something felt off, but he dismissed it just as quickly, assuming maybe Shadow was tired, maybe distracted, maybe just not in the mood. Because the idea that it could mean something more serious never fully formed. Even physical contact changed in ways that were easy to misread. When Ethan reached down to pet him, Shadow still allowed it, still stayed close, but there was a subtle tension in his body, a slight stiffness that lasted just a moment before easing, something so small it could be mistaken for nothing, something that did not match the idea of pain that Ethan had in his head, because pain, in his mind, was supposed to be obvious, loud, impossible to miss. Instead, what he was seeing was quiet, controlled, almost careful, as if Shadow was managing something internally while trying to keep everything else the same, and that was the part Ethan did not understand, because from his perspective, nothing dramatic was happening, nothing urgent, nothing that demanded immediate action. But the truth was already there, not hidden, not invisible, just misunderstood. And every time Ethan chose the easier explanation, every time he labeled it as normal or temporary, he moved one step further away from what Shadow was actually trying to communicate, and the gap between seeing and understanding continued to grow without either of them realizing how much it mattered. As the second week settled in, the changes became harder to ignore, not because they were dramatic, but because they started to affect the moments Ethan cared about most, the ones he used to look forward to without thinking. When he walked through the front door after work, there was always a routine, a familiar rhythm where Shadow would be waiting, tail moving, body leaning forward, a quiet excitement that filled the space without needing noise. But now that moment felt different, not absent. Just muted, like someone had turned the volume down on something that used to be constant. Shadow still came to the door, still acknowledged him, but the energy was lower, the movement slower, and Ethan told himself it was normal, that dogs do not stay the same forever, that maybe this was just what getting older looked like, even though Shadow was not that old, even though something about it did not fully match that explanation. Feeding time changed too. In ways that seemed small enough to dismiss. Shadow would approach his bowl, pause for a second, then start eating, but slower than before, sometimes stopping midway, sometimes walking away and coming back later, and Ethan noticed it just enough to comment on it out loud, joking that Shadow was becoming picky, never considering that appetite can shift when something does not feel right internally. What made it more confusing was that Shadow still wagged his tail, still followed Ethan from room to room, still stayed close enough to feel connected, and those familiar behaviors reassured Ethan. They made everything else feel less important, because how could something be wrong if the dog still acted loving, still stayed loyal, still looked at him with that same steady presence. But underneath those familiar signals, something else was building, something quieter, more controlled. Shadow began to hesitate before jumping onto the couch, something he used to do without thinking. Now there was a brief pause, a calculation, a moment where he shifted his weight as if deciding whether it was worth it, and sometimes he chose not to jump at all, settling instead on the floor without making it obvious. Ethan saw it happen more than once, and each time he gave it a simple explanation. Maybe Shadow was tired, maybe he just did not feel like climbing up, maybe nothing was wrong at all, because the alternative required a different kind of attention. A willingness to question the normal patterns he had already accepted, and that is where the distance grew, not in space, not in obvious behavior, but in understanding, because every sign Shadow gave was still there, still visible, still consistent, but each one was softened by familiarity, filtered through Ethan's expectations of what pain should look like, and as long as it did not match that expectation, it was easy to overlook, easy to explain away, easy to miss the message that was slowly becoming impossible for Shadow to carry alone. By the third week, the changes were no longer just small variations in routine, they were starting to reshape the way Shadow moved through the day, but still not in a way that forced immediate alarm, just enough to create a quiet tension that Ethan could feel without fully understanding. The mornings had become slower, not just in how Shadow stood up, but in how he carried himself afterward, his steps measured, his posture slightly guarded, as if each movement required a level of awareness that had not been there before, and yet he never stopped following Ethan, never stopped staying close, which made it even harder to believe that something could be wrong. One evening, as Ethan sat on the couch, he noticed Shadow standing a few feet away, watching him, not approaching, not retreating, just standing there with a stillness that felt intentional, and for a moment Ethan hesitated, something in that silence catching his attention. But then he called Shadow over in a light, familiar tone. Expecting the usual response, expecting that easy, automatic movement toward him, Shadow did come, but slower than before, and when Ethan reached out to pet him, there was that same slow reaction, a slight tightening through his body, a brief pause before settling, something so small it could be dismissed, but repeated enough that it was no longer random. Ethan pulled his hand back for a second, watching more closely this time. But Shadow remained calm, tail moving gently, eyes soft, giving no clear sign of distress, and that contradiction made it easy to fall back into the same assumption, that everything was fine, that he was overthinking something that did not need to be analyzed. Later that night, when it was time to sleep, Shadow did something he had never done before. Instead of settling near Ethan's bed, he chose a spot across the room, closer to the wall, lying down in a way that created distance without completely separating himself, and Ethan noticed it immediately, even said his name softly, expecting him to come closer, but Shadow stayed where he was, not ignoring him, just choosing not to move. Ethan lay there for a while, staring into the dim light of the room, feeling that same quiet unease rise again, but instead of following it, he explained it away, telling himself that dogs change their habits, that maybe Shadow just wanted a cooler spot, that maybe nothing about it meant anything at all. What he did not realize was that this was no longer just about behavior, it was about pattern, about consistency, about a series of small decisions Shadow was making with his body that all pointed in the same direction, and the most important part was not that the signs were getting stronger, it was that they were becoming impossible to separate from each other, each one reinforcing the next, forming a message that was clearer than ever, but still just out of reach for someone who was not ready to see it for what it truly was. The moment that finally broke through was so small Ethan almost missed it, and that was what made it different from everything before, because this time it did not feel like a pattern he could explain away, it felt like a reaction he could not ignore. It happened on a quiet afternoon, nothing unusual, just the kind of slow day where everything blends together, and Ethan reached down to pet Shadow the same way he always had. The same casual motion, the same expectation that nothing would change. But this time, as his hand moved closer, Shadow flinched, not dramatically, not in a way that would scare anyone watching from a distance, just a quick, involuntary shift, a tightening through his body that happened before he could stop it, and then just as quickly, he relaxed again, tail moving slightly, eyes softening as if trying to smooth over what had just happened. Ethan froze for a second, his hand hovering in the air. Because that reaction did not fit into any of the explanations he had been using. It did not feel like tiredness, it did not feel like mood, it felt like something else entirely, something deeper, something physical, and for the first time, the thought crossed his mind clearly, not as a passing idea but as a real possibility. What if Shadow was not just acting different, what if he was actually uncomfortable? He pulled his hand back slowly, watching more carefully now, noticing details he had overlooked before, the way Shadow adjusted his posture when he shifted positions, the slight hesitation before settling down, the controlled way he moved as if he was managing something inside his own body. And what made it harder to understand was that Shadow did not pull away from him, did not create distance in the way Ethan expected pain to look. Instead he stayed close, stayed present, still choosing to be near him even while something was clearly not right. And that contradiction made everything more confusing, because in Ethan's mind, pain meant avoidance, pain meant clear rejection, pain meant something obvious and undeniable, but what he was seeing was quiet cooperation. A dog that still trusted him enough to stay, even when staying might not feel good. That night, Ethan could not ignore it anymore, the earlier moment replaying in his head over and over again, each small sign from the past few weeks starting to connect in a way they never had before. The licking, the slower movement, the distance during sleep, the hesitation, all of it forming a pattern that no longer felt random. He sat on the edge of his bed, watching Shadow across the room. Noticing how he lay down carefully, how he shifted once, then again, before finding a position that seemed acceptable, not comfortable, just manageable, and that was the difference Ethan finally began to see. This was not about preference, this was about adaptation. About a body adjusting quietly to something it could not say out loud, and for the first time, Ethan felt something heavier than confusion, something closer to realization, the uncomfortable awareness that the signs had been there all along. Not hidden, not invisible, just waiting for him to understand them before they became too big to ignore. That night, Ethan did something he had not done before. He stopped trying to explain what he was seeing and instead started questioning what he believed. Sitting in the dim light of his living room with his phone in his hand, searching for answers he should have looked for sooner, typing slowly at first, then more urgently, phrases that reflected the doubt growing in his mind. Why does my dog flinch when I touch him? Signs a dog is uncomfortable but not showing it. And then finally the question that made him pause before hitting enter. Do dogs hide pain? The answers did not come all at once, but the pattern was immediate. Consistent across everything he read, every source repeating the same idea in different words. Dogs do not show pain the way humans expect, they do not cry out, they do not draw attention, they minimize, they adjust, they continue. And as Ethan read further, something shifted inside him, because each explanation did not feel new, it felt familiar, like it was describing something he had already seen but failed to recognize. The licking was not random. It could be a response to discomfort. The slower movement was not laziness, it could be a sign of stiffness or sensitivity. The distance during sleep was not preference, it could be a way to manage pressure or avoid contact. And the flinch, the small, almost invisible reaction that had unsettled him earlier, was not overreaction, it was communication, just not in a language he had been paying attention to. Ethan lowered his phone slowly, his mind moving back through the past few weeks, replaying moments with a new perspective, each one gaining weight, each one becoming clearer now that he was looking at it differently. And what unsettled him the most was not any single behavior, it was how consistent they had been, how patient Shadow had been in showing them without ever escalating, without ever forcing the message in a way Ethan could not ignore. He looked over at Shadow, lying quietly across the room, and for the first time he noticed not just where he was, but how he was, the careful positioning, the subtle tension that never fully disappeared, the way he seemed to settle into positions that worked rather than ones that felt natural, and it hit Ethan in a way that was difficult to put into words. Shadow had not changed suddenly, he had been adapting gradually. adjusting to something Ethan had not taken the time to understand, and that realization carried a weight that was hard to shake, because it meant this was not something new, this was something ongoing, something that had been building quietly while Ethan continued to see it as normal, and the most difficult part was not accepting that Shadow might be in pain, it was accepting that the signs had been there the entire time, not hidden, not silent, just waiting for someone to understand what they meant before it became too late to respond the way it should have been done from the beginning. The next morning felt different before anything even happened, like the weight of what Ethan had learned overnight had already shifted the way he saw everything, and when he looked at Shadow, he was no longer seeing a dog who was just acting a little off. He was seeing a series of signals layered on top of each other, waiting to be understood, and that changed how every movement looked, how every pause felt, how every small behavior carried meaning. When Shadow stood up, Ethan noticed the way he redistributed his weight before taking his first step, not dramatically, not in a way that would stop him from moving, but carefully, like someone adjusting to discomfort without letting it show. And this time Ethan did not look away, he stayed with that moment, letting it register fully instead of smoothing it over with an easy explanation. During breakfast, when Shadow approached his bowl and paused again, Ethan did not assume hesitation, he saw calculation, a brief moment where Shadow seemed to assess before committing, and when he began to eat, slower than before, stopping halfway through, Ethan felt something tighten in his chest, because now that behavior had context, it was no longer random, it was part of something consistent. The realization did not come as a sudden shock, it came as a quiet alignment, every piece fitting into place at the same time, forming a picture that had been incomplete before. And that picture carried a simple but difficult truth: Shadow had been communicating the entire time, not loudly, not urgently, but clearly enough for someone who knew how to read it. Ethan sat down on the floor that morning instead of the couch, lowering himself to Shadow's level without reaching out immediately, giving him space, watching more closely than he ever had, and for a moment, Shadow looked back at him, holding that gaze just a fraction longer than he had in recent days, not because something had changed in his condition, but because something had changed in Ethan's attention. When Ethan finally moved his hand forward, he did it slower, more deliberately, stopping just short of contact, letting Shadow choose whether to close the distance, and when Shadow leaned forward slightly, just enough to meet his hand on his own terms, the movement was small, but it carried meaning, it showed that the bond was still there, that the trust had not disappeared, even if something else was wrong beneath the surface. And that was the part that stayed with Ethan the most, not the fear, not the uncertainty, but the understanding that Shadow had never stopped trusting him, even while dealing with something uncomfortable, even while adjusting in ways Ethan had not understood, and that realization brought with it a sense of urgency that felt different from panic. It felt focused, grounded in the awareness that recognizing the signs was only the first step, that what mattered now was what he did next, because for the first time, he was no longer guessing, he was seeing. And once you see something clearly, you cannot go back to pretending it is not there. The drive to the clinic felt longer than it actually was, not because of distance, but because of everything Ethan was carrying in his mind, every small moment replaying with a clarity he had not allowed himself before, each sign now impossible to ignore, each memory reshaped by what he understood now instead of what he had assumed then. Shadow sat quietly in the back seat, not restless, not anxious, just present, watching the passing light through the window with that same calm awareness he had always had, and that made it harder in a different way, because nothing about him looked urgent, nothing about him demanded immediate concern in the way Ethan used to expect, and yet everything about him now felt important. When they arrived, the process was simple, calm, routine. But Ethan's perspective was no longer the same. Every movement Shadow made in that room stood out, the way he stepped onto the scale, the way he turned slightly before sitting down, the way he adjusted his position more than once before settling. And this time Ethan did not dismiss any of it, he watched, he noticed. He stayed present in a way he had not been before. When the veterinarian examined Shadow, her approach was gentle, measured, moving slowly, observing carefully. And at one point she paused, her hand resting lightly along his side. Then she looked up at Ethan with a calm expression that carried more meaning than her words alone. "He has been compensating for a while," she said, not alarmed, not dramatic, just certain, and that sentence settled into Ethan with a weight that was both heavy and clarifying, because it confirmed what he had begun to understand, that this was not sudden, not recent, this had been building quietly over time. She explained how dogs adjust, how they shift their behavior to manage discomfort, how they continue to engage, continue to stay close, continue to trust, even when something is not right, and as she spoke, Ethan realized that every example she gave matched something he had seen, something he had explained away, something he had chosen not to question. He looked down at Shadow, who remained calm, steady, still choosing to stay close, still leaning slightly toward him when given the chance. And that was the moment everything settled into place, not with panic, not with guilt alone, but with a deeper understanding of what had been happening all along. The signs had never been hidden, they had never been silent in the way Ethan once believed, they had been expressed in the only way Shadow knew how, through small adjustments, through subtle changes, through consistency over time. And the difference was not in how loudly they were shown, but in how clearly they were understood. As Ethan rested his hand gently near Shadow, allowing him to decide the contact, he felt a shift in himself, a recognition that this moment was not just about responding now, it was about seeing differently moving forward, about understanding that connection is not built on obvious signals, but on attention, on presence, on the willingness to notice what is easy to overlook. And as he sat there, he realized something that stayed with him long after they left that room. Your dog does not need to speak for you to understand them, but they do need you to truly see them. Because the difference between missing the signs and recognizing them is not what your dog shows you,